at Brigham Young University. He then earned a Master of Arts in History and a Master of Library and Information Sciences at BYU. He's the author of Penny Tracts and Polemics, a critical analysis of anti-Mormon pamphleteering in Great Britain, 1837 and 1860, which we happen to have for sale in the bookstore back there. He's also published articles in scholarly journals, including Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought, Genealogical Journal, Journal of John Whitmer Association, and a whole bunch more that I'm not going to read, and so that way he has more time. For that, I'll turn the time over to Craig Foster.
Full-time employee.
You know, I can honestly say this thing is intimidating. As Scott said, I published a book on early Mormon pamphleteering in Great Britain, 1837-1860. When I talked with them about presentation, we discussed the idea of kind of relating some of the themes and imagery of early Mormon, early anti-Mormon literature to what we have today. And so that is the emphasis of my paper. I've titled the paper, Old Themes and Stereotypes Never Die, The Unchanging Ways of Anti-Mormons. Now what you're going to be hearing today is about half of what my paper is. The old thing where you keep writing and all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, you know, there's no way that I'm going to be able to fit it into the time period. Well, that's what happened. And so eventually we'll have the full text available. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. A writer once said, if you can't annoy somebody, there's little point in writing. Now, while obviously tongue-in-cheek, this statement nonetheless delivers a powerful message concerning the importance of the printed word. In modern technical societies, the art of communication and dissemination of knowledge are of extreme importance. These are enhanced through the circulation of various ideas, concepts, and beliefs. Without the publication of such, it would be extremely difficult to communicate new ideas and beliefs to a large population. While oral traditions and other forms of verbal communication have existed among the inhabitants of the world since time immemorial, the power of the written and printed word cannot be underestimated. This is particularly true with religion. Both apologists of a religious movement and its adversaries are responsible for producing large amounts of published materials. As an example, the conflict between believers and antagonists and the voluminous products of such religious turmoil, one needs to look no further than the mountains of material containing attacks and counterattacks between Catholics and Protestants. Perhaps the best-known anti-Catholic work of the 19th century was Maria Monk's Awful Disclosures of the Hotel Dieu Nunnery, which was published in 1836 in New York City. The tract launched a flourishing genre of works detailing the purported immorality of Catholic priests and nuns. Among the anti-Catholic tracts printed on the European side of the Atlantic were The Adventure of Isabella with a Friar Who Debauched Her Before an Altar at 13 years old, and The Cloisters Laid Open. However, sensational and titillating polemics were not published only against Catholics. The Female Husband, published in 1746, portrayed Methodists as, quote, hypocritical perverts keen on lesbian and homosexual activities, end quote, while the New Bath Guilds, published in 1766, ridiculed a, quote, fornicating Methodist preacher, end quote. Indeed, a number of the religious denominations, which varied from the accepted mainstream denominations, were the targets of polemical writers. Today, the publication of literature against Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and just about every other religion and denomination continues. For instance, modern anti-Catholic attacks, which involve not only traditional print media, but also the internet, film, and television, include the same insinuations of illicit sexual relations between priests and nuns, as well as priests and their parishioners. A good example is the British film The Magdalene Sisters, which just came out in 2003. It bases the plot on the actual Magdalene laundries, which were run by the Sisters of Mercy for girls who were regarded as sinners and had to do penance. However, while the film is not based on any real girls, it portrays the characters as real, including little epilogues at the end of the film, explaining what happened to them in their later lives. The film includes cruelty by the nuns against the girls, a seducing priest, and female nudity in what one Catholic apologist compared to the adventures of Maria Monk. Catholics are not the only religious adherents to be accused of improper activity or be described with sensational imagery and stereotypes. Among the numerous victims of attack are Pentecostals, who are described in some sources as sex-crazed. Even Christians in general are depicted in cliched stereotypes as judgmental, narrow-minded, determined to spoil a party, and fanatical. Stereotyping is a natural function of the human mind to simplify a complex reality. Quote, a stereotype is a standardized conception or image of a specific group, or people, or objects, end quote. In other words, stereotypes are mental cookie cutters. However, stereotypes are also used to introduce or reinforce negative attitudes about a group of people based on characteristics such as age, sex, race, nationality, or religion, like the examples already given for the Catholic and other Christian churches. The same is true with Mormonism. As numerous as the attacks against Mormonism are the various themes and arguments used by anti-Mormon writers. As with any other genre of literature, anti-Mormon writers write with their audience in mind. They select the themes which they think will be the most entertaining, or believable, or influential, and ultimately persuasive in regard to their message. With these themes come tried and true images and stereotypes. This paper will look at anti-Mormon themes and how they have and have not changed from the 1800s to the present. While anti-Mormons have used many themes and images, this paper will focus on only two interrelated themes. First, denigrating the character of Joseph Smith, and second, accusations of immorality of Mormons and Mormonism. Obviously, a person could write a book about each of these categories, therefore the examples will be limited for time and space purposes. Mormonism Unveiled, published in 1834 by Eber D. Howe, was, quote, the genesis of many later anti-Mormon works, end quote. The book itself was, in large measure, a compilation of affidavits and stories collected by Dr. Velasquez Hurlbut, a former member of the church. This book laid the foundation of future anti-Mormon works as it introduced the themes and methods of attack used by many future anti-Mormon publications. The Smiths were described as being, quote, lazy, indolent, ignorant, and superstitious, end quote. Joseph Smith and his family were also described as being involved in money digging and folk magic, and Joseph's use of a seer stone was also discussed. Other anti-Mormon writers have used Howe's arguments and accusations. For example, the first known anti-Mormon pamphlet published in Great Britain included a large portion of material taken from Howe's book. Indeed, the theme of the Reverend Richard Livesey's tract was the questionable character of Joseph Smith and his family and their involvement in money digging. Livesey accused the Smith family of being known fortune tellers and described how they used certain arts of juggling to find treasure. The Reverend Samuel Haining stated that not since the days of Muhammad had there been a more awful delusion to mislead men. According to Haining, Joseph Smith's character had been evil from the very beginning. An American writer even went as far as to suggest the whole Smith family, quote, were unqualified atheists, end quote. The evil character of Joseph and other members of the Smith family was also a theme expounded upon by William Palmer in his tract, The External Evidences of the Book of Mormon. He began by stating that Joseph Smith was, quote, a sorcerer, a liar, an impostor, a vagabond, a swindler, end quote. As an example of the evil character of Smith and his followers, Palmer portrayed the men as a group of necromancers. He related how Smith used a peepstone to look for buried treasure that was guarded by evil spirits. He described how Joseph Smith had sacrificed a goat in order to get past the evil spirits. However, according to Palmer, quote, the devil kept his money and the Smiths ate his mutton, end quote. The picture here is from Howe's book, and it's obviously, you can see the devil is getting the best of Joseph Smith. Modern anti-Mormon publications have also included attacks on Joseph Smith's character. In recent years, the attacks have particularly focused on the theme of Joseph Smith as a treasure seeker who used folk magic. Joseph Smith has been described as, quote, a man who pretended to discover for a fee where buried treasure was located, end quote. And the Smith family, quote, was given to dabbling in the mysteries of divination, glass-looking, peepstoning, and abrak, end quote. We have here an example from the Evangel. What I'll do is just continue with the reading and let you look at the overheads, or we'll never get done. So hopefully you can tell what it is from the source there. Of even more significance has been the attempt to portray Joseph Smith as a necromancer using black magic. Well, William Palmer's description of Smith sacrificing a goat in order to appease evil spirits guarding the buried treasure was not by happenstance. The practice of black magic is akin to devil worship. Indeed, satanic rituals involve animal sacrifice, and a goat's head is symbolic of a pentagram, which is referred to as, quote, the consummate symbol of Satan, end quote. William J. Schneblin, whose shady past and questionable activity should cause concern to any discerning reader, has been particularly outspoken in his accusations of Joseph Smith's involvement in the occult. Furthermore, Schneblin's sensationalistic pamphlets, Mormonism's Temple of Doom and Whited Sepulchres, claim the temple ceremonies to have their foundation in witchcraft and masonry. Not all anti-Mormon publications come from ministries and other openly antagonistic publishers like Triple J Publications, which published Schneblin's works. In fact, there is a very recent example of an anti-Mormon work published by Doubleday, a large mainstream publisher. John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven, A Story of Violent Faith, which borrows heavily from polemical works on Mormonism, picks up on the theme of Joseph Smith's treasure hunting and folk magic. For example, he describes Smith's scrying and treasure hunting, stating, quote, soon his necromantic skills were sufficiently in demand that he was able to command respectable fees to find buried treasure for property owners, end quote. However, Krakauer does not stop there. In relating the birth of Mormonism in upstate New York, he writes, quote, Joseph's flirtation with folk magic as a young man had a direct and unmistakable bearing on the religion he would soon usher forth, end quote. In fact, in introducing Moroni's original visit, Krakauer continues, quote, peepstones and black magic would again loom large in Joseph's life, end quote. Now, while the focus of this paper is not Krakauer's book, his background, biases, and poor scholarship cannot go unnoticed as an example of anti-Mormonism masquerading as a scholarly work or a book which will supposedly allow readers a glimpse at the true history, doctrines, and nature of Mormonism. Furthermore, his book boils down to nothing more than a regurgitation of old anti-Mormon themes such as Joseph Smith's character, Mormon polygamy, Danites, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and other so-called problematic areas of Mormon history. Krakauer catapulted to fame with the publication of Into Thin Air, a cathartic biographical account of climbing Mount Everest. He is an excellent writer and has a very good gift for being able to portray things in a colorful and fascinating way. In fact, practically all of his previous works have dealt with extreme behavior and outdoor pursuits and have been very, very popular because of his gift for writing. Thus, it was surprising a man of his background, especially given the fact he admits being raised an atheist, would take on such a complex subject that had nothing to do with mountains. Now, Krakauer, although he's described as being a very gifted writer, he is also described as being a one-sided journalist. and viewing such religious actions as wearing sacred garments as, quote, freakishness rather than fervor, end quote, and concluding that the book, quote, provides more voyeuristic astonishment than curiosity or understanding. Unsurprisingly, the LDS Church has reacted quickly and negatively to Krakauer's book. He, in turn, has publicly vacillated between anger and belligerency and hurt and puzzlement. In a Salt Lake Tribune editorial, he stated he was saddened that the church had, quote, elected to regard his book in such a reductionist light, end quote. Krakauer later commented how hurt he was about the church's negative reaction and then said, "I hope people don't think this is an anti-Mormon book." John Krakauer's denials of being an anti-Mormon fly in the face of his comments as well as his book signing schedule. On Krakauer's own webpage, his book signing and speaking engagements included not only the usual bookstores, but also the First Parish of Cambridge Church, Unity Church, First Congregational Church, and Unity Temple on the Plaza. These are churches located in various parts of the country. Either Krakauer is knowingly playing to the critics of the church in order to sell more books, or he truly has been, as some people have suggested, into thin air a little too often. Either way, Krakauer not only focuses on Joseph Smith's folk magic and treasure hunting, but also on the ever-popular theme of Smith's supposed sexual impropriety by recounting the same old stories and accusing Joseph Smith of sexual recklessness. However, Krakauer certainly is not alone with his accusations, most of which go back to the early days of the church. Stories accusing Joseph Smith of adultery and polygamy began to circulate while he was still alive and became even more numerous after his death. For example, in one of the editions of Gerald and Sandra Tanner's Salt Lake City Messenger, in an article titled "Joseph Smith and Women," he is accused of having a sexual problem in that, quote, he was unsatisfied living with just one wife, end quote. This sexual problem, according to the Tanners, led him to introduce plural marriage. Furthermore, the article emphasized Smith married several teenage women and that, quote, the system of polygamy he set up was very detrimental to young women and children, end quote. While Joseph Smith was and continues to be the main target of stories of sexual impropriety, his prophetic successors, as well as the regular membership, have also been the focus of tales describing licentious activity. The non-Mormon obsession with Mormon sexual mores is found in three distinct forms, all of which merge to a degree one with another. These three forms are the temple ceremony and supposed sexual activity therein, plural marriage and tales of rape and bondage, and the idea of Mormon immorality as a result of teachings and experiences. The juxtaposing of sexual license in the temple ceremony began with the first known expose on the Mormon temple. This was published by a husband and wife team, Increase and Maria Van Dusen. In 1847, they published a pamphlet concerning the inner workings of the Nauvoo temple. Between 1847 and 1852, the Van Dusens published at least 7 pamphlets on Mormonism and the temple ceremony. The tracts varied little in their content from each other. All of them claimed to disclose the deep, dark secrets of Mormonism. In A Dialogue Between Adam and Eve, the Lord and the Devil, called The Endowment, the underlying message was the thinly veiled eroticism of the temple ceremony. According to the tract, the first step taken in the ceremony was for the couple to be separated, undressed, and washed and anointed all over their body. In explaining this part of the ceremony, Increase wrote, "There is a variety of ceremony going on in this room, some of rather too delicate a nature to speak of, as this work is designed to be read by all classes of both sex," end quote. This vague reference left the impression of lascivious behavior on the part of the Mormons. Van Dusen also mentioned the spiritual life doctrine, and by 1852, the underlying message of sexuality had become blatant. The cover of the tract portrays a man pointing to a woman draped provocatively in some robes. The woman's legs and left breast are bare. With the text is found another illustration entitled "Bridal Couch of the Spiritual Wife." This pictures a woman reclining on a couch with a robe covering only the lower half of her body. Other early anti-Mormon writers used Van Dusen's theme of sexual impropriety in the temple. In Mormonism Exposed, John Bowes gave an interesting discussion concerning the temple ceremony and the plurality of wives, under the titillating title, Hidden Orgies of Mormonism Practiced in the Nauvoo Temple. Bowes described the spiritual wife doctrine, or as he termed it, universal female prostitution, and warned his readers to, quote, take care of their wives and daughters and preserve them from ever being contaminated by the pestilential breath of adulterers and fornicators, end quote. The theme of illicit immoral activity in conjunction with the temple ceremony certainly continues to the present. For example, the movie Temple of the God Makers discusses what they call, quote, bizarre secret practices, end quote, in the temple, and later referred to the Mormon concept of eternal life as, quote, endless celestial sex, end quote. Judy Robertson, in her book, Out of Mormonism, A Woman's True Story, also discussed parts of the temple ceremony and described being in almost a trance-like state during a large portion of the ceremony in which she, quote, felt defiled, ashamed, and bewildered, end quote. 19th century accusations of licentious temple ceremonies, as well as the accusations of spiritual wifery and religious prostitution, were increased an hundredfold with the 1852 public announcement of the doctrine and practice of polygyny, or plural marriage. During the next few decades, a particularly colorful and interesting genre of polemical literature arose. This was the narrative genre of kidnap and seduction, rape and bondage. Most of these stories had a certain format which was, ironically enough, borrowed from 18th and 19th century pornographers. This format involved the following. The story was related in the first person. The story involved kidnap and or seduction of an innocent and naive virgin to an exotic place, rape and or defilement of said virgin, subsequent depression and despair because of the depravity of the situation, and finally escape and the opportunity to tell all. One of the earliest and best examples of the resemblance of themes used by both pornographers and those writing sexually oriented fiction was The Lustful Turk, published in 1828. The book's plot is simple, as is the case with most works of that genre. The story concerned two young ladies named Emily and Sylvia. Sylvia was kidnapped by the Dey, or lustful Turk, who then set up a scheme wherein she would be in a state of mind to be subjected to his desires. She was taken to a slave market where she was handled, fondled, and humiliated. The Dey then arrived disguised as a representative of the French consulate and bought her. This, he told her, was to save her from the lustful Turk. He then arranged for a fake marriage to be performed by a fake English priest. She was then deflowered and gave a new sense of her sexuality. At this moment, the Dey revealed his true identity. Sylvia was then reunited with Emily, who had already become the Dey's sexual slave before Sylvia's own seduction. They were content to be with the Dey in a menage a trois. However, it all ended abruptly when the Dey attempted to deflower yet another young virgin and was castrated by the girl. The Turk, no longer feeling as lustful as before, released Sylvia and Emily, and they returned to England to tell all about their adventures. Now, you're probably all wondering why I am telling you all of this. You'll see. Although obviously a fictional tale, the book took on a certain air of reality by, as previously mentioned, being related in first person. This is because, quote, in some primitive way, a story told in the first person may seem closer to actuality, less invented, less a fantasy, more immediate and authentic than a narrative in any other form, end quote. For this reason, The Lustful Turk used this format. Many anti-Mormon novels had a similar format. This is particularly true with works written by former Mormons. Most of these followed the format of going to an exotic place, Salt Lake City. Yes, at one time that was considered exotic. Being held in some form of captivity, physical or emotional, witnessing or experiencing sexual bondage and licentiousness, and eventually escaping and publishing the experiences. Probably the most important convention for both pornographer and anti-Mormon writer was the image of the innocent victim, a device borrowed straight from Maria Monk's exploits in a Catholic nunnery. The main theme of Victorian pornography, quote, was the defilement of purity, and the most pure object available for exploitation was a young virgin, usually blonde, and always having large eyes, end quote. Maria Ward, in her 1855 book, Mormonism Unveiled, described her heroine as, quote, scarcely 18 years of age, of full-rounded form and complexion that rivaled the peach when ripened by the southern sun, lips of the cherry, and eyes liquid and blue as the heart of a spring violet, end quote. Orville of Belle-Isle's heroine had a soft and, quote, voice with, quote, pearly lids drooping over her dove-like eyes, while the massive golden curls fell over her brow and neck, end quote. In pornography, women are disposable. They cease to exist once they have served their purposes. In the case of Victorian anti-Mormon literature, the seduced girl almost always dies, not only heightening the pathos and stressing her passivity, but tidying up any loose ends quickly. For example, one sensationalistic tract titled Appalling Disclosures matched its lurid seductions with victims' deaths from sorrow and shame, tempered by a few who went mad. However, in these tales of pathos, there is always at least one woman who lives to escape and publish her horrible experiences with the Mormons, thus telling all. Although not as sensationalistic nor as explicit as 19th century anti-Mormon literature, modern anti-Mormon literature still uses borrowed imagery and literary motifs. For example, Utah Mission's The Inner Circle once published an article supposedly written by a concerned mother. This mother recounted how her daughter Heather, quote, who has blonde curly hair and piercing blue eyes, end quote, had been lured away from Christianity to Mormonism. Another modern example of using the narrative imagery already discussed are the two novels written by Marion Wells, whose family background is LDS, although she appears to never have actively participated in the church. Both of her historical romantic novels are cliched and excruciatingly amateurish. However, while both books use traditional imagery, such as describing the heroine, Rebecca Wellstone, as an innocent young orphan with, quote, heavy taffy-colored braids, end quote, who later travels to far-off southern Utah, neither of the books describe any overt sensuality. The books do describe Rebecca's journey to Utah, her continued questions about Adam, God, blood atonement, and other discomforting issues. She eventually fell in love with Andrew, one of the presiding elders of the Southern communities, and married him only to discover too late that she was his second wife. Naturally, Wells described the misery and despair of living in polygamy. These books do nevertheless utilize certain themes and imagery mentioned above. These themes are aimed at a certain audience and are meant to reinforce already existing misconceptions about Latter-day Saints. Obviously, one of the main themes was the evil nature of polygamy. A sub-theme in the second book was how dirty Rebecca felt for having been involved with plural marriage and other Mormon teachings. The idea that members of the LDS Church have become desensitized to accepted mores has also been a common theme since the 19th century. For example, in The Mysteries of Mormonism, the author lamented the, quote, indecency in conversation of women and children. Several wives of one man, the Mormons, quote, were unaccustomed, end quote. Another critic, John Benjamin Franklin, complained how polygamy made men and women lose, quote, all decency and self-respect and degenerate of disgusting animals, end quote. As a result of this supposed degeneration of moral values, were, according to anti-Mormons, the existence of child sexual abuse and incest in Mormons. Indeed, several early anti-Mormon writers charged the Mormons with practicing, quote, the fearful sin of incest, which is so intimately and closely connected with polygamy, end quote. Two contemporary examples of Mormon immorality were found in The God Makers and The Evangel. Both discussed sexually active teenagers and accused the church of creating an atmosphere where such activity and subsequent out-of-wedlock births would be so prevalent. In fact, the evangelical article, Teenage Immorality, ended by stating, quote, "Yet the fact that it," meaning teenage pregnancies, happens to the extent it does in Utah is evidence that Mormonism does not improve morals. Indeed, the numbers appear to show that except for a minority of Utah's Mormons, being a member of the LDS Church actually erodes moral values, end quote, ignoring the fact that Utah teenage pregnancies continue to be well below the national average. However, the evangel is following the well-known anti-Mormon mantra, "The truth should never get in the way of a great sensational accusation." The same insinuation of the church creating the perfect climate for immoral activity can be found in a multi-issue series of the Utah Evangel titled Child Sexual Abuse and the LDS Church, A Personal Journey. This series of articles describe the experience of Jeff McAllister, who was abused over a long period of time by his bishop. In introducing the subject, McAllister wrote, quote, "While the problem crosses many lines, certain teachings and practices in the LDS Church lead to a real problem with this kind of abuse," end quote. A very recent and very public example can be given to better illustrate the misinterpretation of facts, the misunderstanding of personal actions versus church doctrine and procedure, and ultimately an underlying bias against the church. This is a direct result of misinformation, which, if not actually planted by old as well as contemporary anti-Mormons, has certainly been reinforced by their propaganda being promulgated both in print and in different media, such as the internet. This past March, young Elizabeth Smart was found alive and well in Sandy, Utah. Her kidnapping the previous June had made news not only in Utah, but across the country and indeed around the world. However, very soon after her rescue, rumors began to filter out to the media that Elizabeth Smart's captors were religious fanatics with a connection to the LDS Church, and that she had been kidnapped in order to become a polygamous wife. Although the media attempted to distinguish between the mainstream church and its various offshoots, more often than not, all were mixed together, and the resulting newspaper and television reports blurred the lines to the point that the average reader or listener would not be able to differentiate between the various groups. Moreover, at the public announcement of the charges against David Bryan Mitchell and Wanda Barzee, Smart's abductors, the rumors and suggestions of sexual assault were confirmed. For many critics of the church, the charges of sexual assault incomprehensibly reconfirmed for them previously held notions of Mormonism and immorality. An email sent to various news outlets and other places by an Arizona woman claiming to be a doctor made incredible accusations which appear to reflect some of the themes of anti-Mormonism. Quote, "If I were 15 years old, in excellent athletic health and could run, rich, talented, popular, a virgin not used to sex, had a great family and family to return to, I would find a way to escape my abductor. I would have found the right moment with God's help and fled. All of our alarms are going off when a 15-year-old beautiful girl does not find an exit from a pedophile who is not threatening her with a knife or gun. I have watched a TV program about the Mormon religion and the belief that a father, uncle, or male household authority figure feels he has the right to introduce his daughter to sex. The daughter is taught that she is to accept sex from male spiritual leaders. It is my opinion that this situation could have occurred because the daughter had been repeatedly introduced to sex by male religious leaders. This was a familiar situation to her," end quote. This supposed doctor was not alone with accusations of Mormon immorality, child abuse, and other problems. One online essay titled "About Elizabeth Smart on Polygamy" referred to plural marriage as, quote, "a hideous, disgusting legacy that will forever haunt the annals of Mormonism," end quote. And another accused the church of permitting, quote, "abuses of women and children," end quote. John Krakauer also discussed the Elizabeth Smart case.
His book mentioned Mitchell's desire to make Smart, quote, a polygamous concubine, end quote. Krakauer concluded Smart would have been susceptible to Mitchell's, quote, weird self-styled wedding ritual to seal Elizabeth Smart and himself in the new and everlasting covenant, a Mormon euphemism for polygamous marriage, end quote. He then explained, quote, raised to obey figures of Mormon authority unquestioningly and to believe that LDS doctrine is the law of God, she would have been particularly susceptible to the dexterous fundamentalist spin Mitchell applied to familiar Mormon scripture. The white robes Mitchell and Barzee wore and forced Elizabeth to wear resembled the sacred robes she had donned with her family when they had entered the Mormon temple. When Mitchell bullied Elizabeth into submitting to his carnal demands, he used the words of Joseph Smith, words she had been taught were handed down by God himself to phrase these demands, end quote. To back up his claim, Krakauer quoted Debbie Palmer, a former fundamentalist plural wife and currently an anti-polygamy activist, quote, being brought up as she was made her especially vulnerable. Mitchell would never have been able to have such power over a non-Mormon girl, end quote. These two statements demonstrate not only a bias that any decent scholar or journalist would seek to avoid, but also a profound ignorance of Mormon doctrine and practice. Two examples will suffice. First, Krakauer stated that Elizabeth would have worn temple robes when she accompanied her family into an LDS temple. This, of course, is patently false, as she was born in the covenant. And I know that because I checked Ancestral File. She would not have gone into any part of the temple but where youth are allowed to go, such as the baptismal font. Even if she had not been born in the covenant and had later been sealed to her parents, she would not have worn the temple robes, as she had not personally gone through the endowment ceremony. Secondly, the statement by Debbie Palmer is ridiculous when carefully analyzed. Palmer moved with her parents to the fundamentalist community of Creston Valley, British Columbia, when she was 2 years old. She was raised in this community and entered into her own plural marriage when she was 15 years old. Eventually, she left the fundamentalist LDS Church and has been an outspoken critic of Mormon fundamentalism. Therefore, for Palmer to speak as an expert on whether or not Mitchell would have influence over a girl who has been raised in the LDS Church, it's like comparing broccoli to cauliflower. Broccoli may have come from cauliflower, but it is now significantly different and is considered a completely separate vegetable. From the questionable background and immoral character of Joseph Smith to the licentious teachings and practices of Mormonism and its adherents, both old and new anti-Mormon works have trumpeted the supposed problems of the prophet and members of the church. Remarkably, the themes have not changed that much from the earliest days. Significantly, accusations of immorality have extended from Joseph Smith to the church membership as a whole. However, of a necessity, tales and tactics have changed over time. For example, with the availability of the temple ceremony on audio and videotape, tales Instead, most modern anti-Mormons only suggest an innate sensuality in certain parts of the ceremony. Furthermore, while stories of sexual abuse, underage brides, and other stories are told about fundamentalist offshoots, sophisticated or skeptical to unquestioningly believe accounts of innocent virgins kidnapped and held in the temple for the pleasure of the Mormon elders. Even so, some of the imagery remains, with the problems of fundamentalist polygamy being projected onto the mainstream church in sensationalistic descriptions as a result of the supposed original evil introduced by Joseph Smith. Continuing in that theme are the stories of moral problems among Mormons in general as a result of their history and doctrines. Why then, I'm almost done. Why then do anti-Mormons so viciously attack the character of Joseph Smith and members of the church? In an excellent article titled Celsus and Modern Anti-Mormonism, Aaron Christensen compared the significant parallels in the writings of an early anti-Christian named Celsus with the modern anti-Mormon writers. Both Celsus and his modern counterparts attack the church through, quote, exaggerated distortion, sensationalism, and casting everything in the worst possible light, end quote. Even more significant, though, to those who have studied anti-Mormon literature were the terms Celsus used to describe Jesus Christ and his family. He described Mary as, quote, a woman of no breeding, end quote, and Jesus himself as a, quote, sorcerer, arrogant, a liar, a magician, a profaner, deceitful, and poor, end quote. His apostles were, quote, 10 or 11 unsavory characters, end quote, and his followers were stupid and, quote, shady moral characters, end quote. Even as Celsus tried to dissuade people from converting to the original Christian church by making a, quote, direct assault on the character of the saints in general and the most prominent leaders in particular, end quote, so too do anti-Mormon writers attack Joseph Smith in particular and members of the church in general with accusations of corruption and immorality. Humanly is written, quote, it has been the practice of religious polemic in every age to attack not what the opposition practice and preach, but our impression of what they practice and preach, end quote. I will add that polemical writers also attack by creating or building on popular impressions and stereotypes of the leaders and members with hopes that by destroying the respectability and thus the credibility of a religious leader or the people, the church itself will suffer. Thus, we see yet again, there really is nothing new under the sun when it comes to anti-Mormon literature. Thank you.
Any questions for this? I do want to remind you that we do have one walking up. I want to remind you that we do have his book that sells for $40. We have it back there for $34.95. Also want to remind you that the auction closes at 4 o'clock, and then by 5 o'clock they can figure out who has what, who wins what, and determine your feedback sheets and other stuff. So now, question.
I just wanted to say something when you brought up the Elizabeth Smart's experience. Many of us here know a very compassionate and sensitive associate of the church named Colleen Rawson. And she recently wrote, I just wanted to bring this up and ask your impression. She talked about when the leaders have spoken, I think it's been done, and talked about the 14 fundamentals following the prophet by Elder Benson. And then she said about this whole experience that Mitchell and his wife are charged with aggravated kidnapping, burglary, and sexual assault. Mormons and others have wondered about Mitchell if he was mad, as he claimed he had visions just like Joseph Smith, and God told him there was no longer a true church and he had to start one to be the new prophet just like Joseph Smith. And he wrote or plagiarized a rambling 27-page paper he called the Book of Emmanuel Isaiah, which he considered scripture just like Joseph Smith. And he took a teenage girl for his bride just like Joseph Smith. We put down Mitchell, but he did nothing that Joseph Smith didn't do. He was just following the prophet. And these sorts of anti-Mormon things are not, I think it's interesting that people tie existing criminals to church leaders or church members. I'm wondering, is that a theme that you found all along, of people trying to get events of the day and tying these people to LDS leaders, or is this something we're seeing just sporadically?
Now, this is a common theme that I have seen back from the early days of the church, where they will pull events and will make accusations, particularly on the leader, Joseph Smith. But Brigham Young, actually, I would venture to guess, had even more stuff written about him than Joseph Smith in terms of, the lustful Turk image and harems and all of that. It's common to pull something, an event or something that people are well aware of, and then try to focus that on the leaders or on the church. Let me mention one thing. We constantly hear about Joseph Smith married teenagers. That was not uncommon on the Western frontier. Any historian, or especially any genealogist, will tell you that was not an uncommon thing. And too often, and even Mormons have that problem, too often we like to project our ideas, our morality, etc., and so forth, onto people from another age. They had a completely different, culture, a completely different way of viewing things. But again, that's a sign of what they do. I hope that helped.
Just wanted to mention that this kind of activity has practical consequences. When I was serving as a bishop in Tacoma, Washington, a woman and her family had recently joined the church. The local chapter of Ex-Mormons for Jesus would shadow the missionaries and find the houses where they were visiting and then follow up with their own. After this woman was baptized, she came to my office and said, I'm horrified that I've joined this church and we want to have our names removed. I said, well, what's changed? Well, I can't be a member of an organization that does what you do in your temples. I said, well, what do we do in our temples? Well, you have sexual orgies, people run around, and you do all these things. I said, well, where did you learn this? Well, some people who belong to your church came and told me this, and they said that if I got you with this, that you would deny it. So I had no recourse but to deny it. And I pointed out to her a number of the older distinguished couples in our ward who were temple workers, and asked her if we could really believe that these people were running around the temple naked. It would not be a pretty sight. She left the church.
Well, thank you, Craig. Thank you very much. And it's break time. We have